thank you very much for inviting me. I think the real issue that started us to think a lot about unconscious bias in the work that we're doing in public protection and safety particularly has been this real focus about disproportionality and health inequalities, both in relation to criminal justice outcomes, but also in relation to the well-being of all of our communities, including children and adults. So we set about a kind of focus, a focus that you see there, which is our diagram around trauma-informed approaches. What does trauma do to our physical brain development? And what does that look like and mean in terms of responses and behaviours that children and adults both display? Trauma, as you know, is something that can happen as a one-off, and we talk a lot about war-torn countries and trauma, but it's also about cumulative impact of trauma and things that happen in the family home, like domestic abuse, abuse and neglect, bereavement, loss, parents who have needs that have been left unmet, like substance misuse and mental health, or being in prison. They are all traumatic experiences, both for children and for adults. And we know that trauma impacts on brain development, which means often brain cannot do that consequential thinking that says, if you do this, this is what will happen. And so what we have often talked about in services that I'm looking after at the moment is, how do you think about a trauma recovery model that takes into account this neurological understanding of brain development, and not just thinking about, well, I need to do this action, or I need to put this person on this program, or this 12 weeks of X is going to change their lives. We all know, as practitioners and professionals in our own worlds, that building relationships with individuals is what makes the biggest difference. And thinking about trauma in that way helps us to think about the way in which we work with our families, our children, or our communities. The next circle that we've been focusing a lot on in the borough is this restorative approach. So most of you may have come across restorative conferencing, which came from New Zealand many, many decades ago, which was all about how do you heal harm by victims and perpetrators primarily coming together and talking about what has happened, thinking about the impact and building empathy. But what we've done is actually think about restorative approaches much more broadly, and what it really means is the way in which we speak, the way in which we talk about each other, the way in which we think about strengths and not deficits. So when we're working with families, we don't label and think about, is that a gang nominal, or have you got this disability, or what does that negative language or those labels mean to you as a person when I start putting them on you? Because we do that as professionals because it's easy to say, well, that's your responsibility because it's about CSE, or it's your responsibility because it's about adult social care, instead of thinking about what's the complex nature of the issues and how do we all collectively think about the strengths of the complex issues to find the solutions. The other thing about restorative language is actually talking positively about each other, because our behaviours are really important as people who work in the industries and agencies we do, but also about our partners. How many of us have sometimes said, oh, the police, they're terrible, or the council, they're so awful, they don't do this, this and this, or negative language about any one of us as partners. It doesn't help build trust and confidence. It doesn't help us to work collaboratively together. Yes, we have our issues. Maybe sometimes my services don't respond as quickly as you want, but that's about thinking about the language and the behaviour that we respond and the way in which we speak to each other and about each other. It's really important for communities and partnerships to build on that language. The third bit is unconscious bias. And for us, this has threaded through all of our thinking and the two other approaches that I've just talked about. So this afternoon, I'm going to focus very much on unconscious bias, but you have got slides in your pack that talk to the other two areas. So I'm going to show you some pictures. Whilst we look at these pictures, just think, what are my immediate thoughts and feelings? What are the kind of immediate things that come into my brain as I show you these pictures about the individuals, about the scene, about what might be happening? Are we thinking deficit? Are we thinking strengths? Are we thinking some of those biases that we know apply? These are a group of young women. What biases have we applied to those through our thinking? What about these sorts of pictures? What's the first things that come into our minds when we're looking at this sort of stuff? Right, thinking about the dress, the where it may be. What does this portray to us? This. No, thank you. Any other thoughts on these sorts of pictures? What do we think this group of young men are doing?
Millwall supporters.
Maybe. Here's some other pictures. And further pictures. Now, in all of these pictures, we've made some judgments, haven't we? So, a young person said to me the other day, when I asked him, he's 16, an amazing young boy who has been through criminal justice. And we've been teaching young people unconscious bias. And I said to him, tell me, what does unconscious bias mean to you? And he said, when pictures like this are put in the press, and I happen to wear clothes like this, people think I'm a gang member. He said, when I see, this is a young person, when I see people dressed like this, in suits is the language he used, I think they're rich. So, interestingly, from young people and all of our perspectives, we've played and we've made judgments about all of these pictures. So, let me tell you a few stats about unconscious bias that might help us understand a little bit about why this happens. So there's unconscious bias in terms of gender. Lots of gender stereotypes. Some quotes about women are often not seen as being leaders compared to men. We have less confidence in women as leaders. I didn't say that. Quotes. There's obviously gender pay gap that often has been talked about over the years. Why is that? We think about academic and young people who are better off, i.e. more wealthy, are academically more able. We don't know if that's true, do we? Should we think that? Doesn't sound right to me. Disabled people are more than twice as likely to be out of work than non-disabled people. If you're in an ethnic minority, you are almost 18% less likely to find work in 1997 than someone who's from a white ethnicity background, and now the difference is 13%. We also know that young black men are 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched than other ethnic groups in London. And the last quote does sound very frightening, but it does say that we think it could take 100 years for people from ethnic minorities to share the same job prospects as their white counterparts. So there are some stats, and there are many, many more. Now, what is bias and why is this happening? It's really important that we don't blame ourselves about bias, okay? Because bias is natural, and bias actually goes back to prehistoric times when we had a reptilian brain. So do a bit of neuropsychology now, because I'm no expert, but essentially we used our brains in those times to distinguish between who was a friend and who was an enemy. And our unconscious brain works at speeds and at ways in which we don't fully understand, but at a much kind of greater pace than our conscious brain. And what that does, it helps us to live our lives. It helps us to go about what we're doing, because if we spent hours and hours judging and trying to judge our decisions and trying to think through every decision we make, we would never be able to progress as human beings or to go about our daily lives. So an example I'll give, which is very frivolous, but if I were to go and buy a jumper in a shop today, I'd probably have something in my head about what the jumper should look like. But if I used my conscious brain and tried to evaluate every jumper I saw, think about every shop I went, the price point and all this, I could spend nearly a year trying to decide what jumper I was going to buy. Now, on a very frivolous way, that explains to us why we hold biases, because it has to help us to navigate through our daily lives. However, it's really important that we recognise that those experiences, that a quote is that, there is a thumbprint of our culture that is left on our brain. That is about our subconscious, but our experiences, they also explain a lot of our biases. And you can see here a quote that says, "People are disposed to be biased against people who are unlike them, and favoured towards people who are more like them." Okay? Again, this is not a criticism. So this is about why our brain does what it does and how our brain does what it does. And we often go and find and seek people who either are like us, not just how we look, but how we think. So this whole thing about diversity of thought, which is so important when we start to think about solutions, we shouldn't always gravitate to people who think like us, because you don't get that diversity of thinking. And it's often been said that when we recruit people, in terms of employment, we recruit people who are similar to us. And we shouldn't, should we? Because if you want a diverse group of people who you are working with, the opposite should be applicable. You should be trying to recruit people who are different to you. The other things I think are quite interesting about bias is that we often forget that the whole reptilian brain point I made is that when we are in a traumatized state, or when we are under huge emotional pressure and strain, our brain flips back to some of those responses. And when you talk about trauma, and if you've ever heard Keith or I talk about it, those very kind of basic responses, if a Siberian tiger walked into this theatre now, what would be the responses? Well, it would be flight, fight, or freeze. And the same is applicable when we're under huge emotional stress or strain, that our biases start to go back to what may have been in those kind of very early development stages. And so what we need to be thinking about is not, do I have biases? I don't have any. What we should be asking ourselves is, what biases do I hold? How do I know what they are, recognise what they are, and then think about what action I need to take to mitigate, to make sure that those biases aren't playing into either my assessments with families, or are not playing into my recruitment practice, or are not playing into our language, the way in which we speak. The reason I gave the example about the police, because there are lots of stereotypes that are negative about policing. And often you hear those a lot. Now, do you believe them? Do you agree with them? Is it a bias you hold? Should you hold that? And how do I start to think about what that means if I hold that bias about the police and I'm telling young people, police terrible, awful? Well, actually, that's not helping to keep people safe. And it's also playing out into a really negative stereotype that police are there to do the opposite of what police do, which is to keep communities safe and to keep us safe. So it's really important we think about the bias and our behaviours, and often our behaviours are subtle. We don't deliberately go out of our way and start talking about negative bias or discriminatory language. We don't do that. But we do have subtle ways in which our behaviour may well be seeing some of that unconscious bias play out. So there is a lot of documentation, and I'm happy to circulate it through Michael, but there's so many biases that I could talk about. The kind of main ones I think that we focus a lot on is where we go and seek people like ourselves, or online. Huge issue, I think, for us at the moment is how much stuff do we look at online? So much stuff. How fast are we bombarding our brains with what's online? I mean, you only have to think, I'm going to Google something about something, and suddenly you get 50 things and you're bombarding your reading. If you think about that in terms of traumatized brains and the development that I talked about, a child who's looking at social media with 50 million things coming at their brain, when they haven't developed some of those critical thinking skills, or those, how do I know is this the correct information? How do I challenge this information? Do I believe it? Well, I might believe it because I believe this little thing over here, so all these other things must be true. It's called confirmation bias. So we go and seek things that confirm our own biases. Well, that's sometimes useful, but it's sometimes really, really negative and unhelpful, because you should have a rounded view of issues so that you can understand different perspectives. There's lots of other biases as well that play out, which are about group bias. Again, you will know that if you're in a group, are you the one that follows? Are you the one that's on the bandwagon? Are you the one that will challenge the conversation and the biases that are playing out? All of these things are really important about us as individuals, to not just follow suit with what we see around us, but think about, is that the right approach? Do I need to know more about this? And where can I have that dialogue with others who are different? Last slide from me then is, what do we want to do? What is it you're going to do next as agencies, as individuals about this? So on here are 3 R's that we tend to use, which is to really think and reflect about what we've just done, but to also reflect and think about, why do I think this way? There's another exercise we do, which is you get a list of people, descriptive people, we might say an MP, we might say a family that's just resettled from Syria, we might say a traveller community, and you have to look at this list and sort of rank them as to who you would like as your neighbour. It helps you to start to think about some of your own assumptions and biases. As I said, it's not a right or wrong, we all hold them. So you need to understand what that looks like. And you have to accept that, because if you can't accept it and you do this I have no biases, we can't move forward. Accept it and be aware of it. And then you have to start to ask yourself about, how do you review this, and how do I put myself out of my comfort zone, which is the point there. How do I think about my work and the risks of my biases? How does that impact on my work? And often, training is a solution. And I 100% advocate unconscious bias training. This is not training, this is just me talking. The training can be detailed, it can be a day, it can be a week. There's a whole load of unconscious bias training out there. But what it really does, it makes you spend the time to think about yourself. And then it makes you spend the time to say, how does this change my practice? And that's what we really want to be doing. We want to be saying, I am a modern day individual. I am not the person in prehistoric times. I need to understand my brain and my behaviour and my experiences, and I need to understand what that means in my work practice. It's really important that we don't just also sit in training, because just going to a 3-day course or a 1-day course on fat and sugar and how it's really bad for you doesn't actually help you lose weight. So how do you put it into practice? And so your organisations need to ask yourself the question, do I take this seriously enough? Am I really serious about doing something about this? And if I am, what does that look like as an organisation? Because individually we can do this, and we should. But as an organisation, how do I ask myself those questions about the way in which we operate? Do we have the right behaviours and expectations of staff? And do we give them the skills and understanding about what this looks like in their business area? The other bit about organisational change is also, do we systematically look at our data? Do we actually look at what we know about disproportionality, about health inequalities, all of these words, disparity? Do we understand what that data looks like for us? And then do we work out what our actions should be? I have spent with my colleagues 2 and a bit years now looking at youth justice and disproportionality in the level of detail that we have never done so before. Because if I don't understand what that looks like in that service, we cannot make the changes that make the difference There's no point looking at national stuff. It's helpful, but if you don't drill down and think about the relevance for you in your borough, stroke in your organisation, it will make no change. And what that does, it helps inform policy change. I have now, in one of my services, a trauma-informed unconscious bias policy booklet, this big. All of our policies, we changed our language. We don't talk negatively about children. We think about the way in which we talk about strengths. We have changed our policies. That's what then brings about a whole cultural change in an organisation. And the last things to say is that, if this is a priority, which I hope it is for each and every one of us, we also have to think realistically about what are the small, medium and long-term changes. You can't just go into this and say, I'm going to change it all tomorrow. It's taken us 2 years to get to where I've just described, and it will take us more years to learn and to create a learning environment that will change and completely think newly about some of the things I described about social media. Artificial intelligence, one of the biggest things that's going to change our lives in the next 10 years. Where does bias play out in artificial intelligence? So there was an experiment, I can't actually remember which state in America, but using court outcomes to then say, well, if I then come into court and, I put all of this information against an artificial intelligence robot that's been fed loads of other information from previous cases, what sentence would I get? Well, if we just rewind to David Lammy's review and Baroness Young's review and all the other race disparity reviews that have happened over the decades, we know that there would be some unconscious bias played out in sentencing practice. So by feeding that into a giant robot to give me another outcome over here, is that the right thing to do? How do we change and challenge some of our new technology that could actually be adding to unconscious bias and discrimination and disproportionality? And then I think what's really important is you need champions, you need people who really want to make this happen in organisations, who continuously talk about this stuff, who will not let out that it's just a one-day training, but also to think about what the barriers are in your organisation as to why you can't make this a whole-scale cultural change, and how do we have those conversations so that we can support each other. Because if we don't talk about it, and if we don't challenge each other, you cannot expect communities to just take this on board and to think that that the behaviours that we see in communities are okay, the language that people use around hate and intolerance are okay. And if we don't challenge, and if we think that the social norm is that, then we will never change the social norm. And it may take 100 years, but actually we all have to start now, because then it may not take, and it may take 200 years. And it is upon us all now to make a difference and to really start to think about our biases, our practice, and how we change our policies so that we can make sure all of our communities and all of us get an equal opportunity in life to progress. Thank you very much.